the late 1980s, my older sibling Alex began university as the quintessential fun-loving, carefree student. Alex was obsessed with basketball, chasing girls, and living for the weekend. Politics, not a care in the world. Drugs, never touched them. Life revolved around parties, sports, and maybe, just maybe, earning a degree in marketing by the end of it all. But everything changed during the final semester of Alex's third year when they met a girl named Tara. I remember the summer it all started because Alex practically vanished overnight. No calls, no letters, nothing. It turned out later that Alex had been staying with Tara's uncle in some remote town, but they hadn't bothered to tell anyone. This didn't sit well with our mom, who was frantic with worry, and it infuriated our dad, who blew up when Alex finally returned home. Alex was acting strange, distant, quiet, and almost unrecognizable. It was like they'd been replaced by someone else. That summer marked the beginning of a dramatic transformation. By the time Alex's final year rolled around, they were almost the opposite of the person they'd been as a freshman. Suddenly, Alex was deeply invested in political activism, dabbling in psychedelics, and calling themselves a spiritual explorer. Tara, the new girlfriend, seemed to be the driving force behind this radical shift. She was always by Alex's side, and it was clear she had a significant influence on them. Then, out of nowhere, Alex dropped out of school just 3 months before graduation. They said they didn't need a useless piece of paper and dropped a bombshell that sent chills down my spine. I won't need it where I'm going. Mom begged to know what that meant, but Alex refused to elaborate. After a heated argument with Dad, Alex stormed out, and that was the last we heard from them for nearly a year. Just when we'd started to fear the worst, Alex showed up on our doorstep one evening. It was a bittersweet reunion. While we were overjoyed to see them, it was clear something was terribly wrong. Alex looked like a ghost of their former self, emaciated, aged beyond their years and utterly drained. Their eyes were hollow, and they moved like someone carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. It was terrifying to witness. But where had Alex been all that time? And what had happened to them? For months, I was left in the dark. Mom and Dad would only say that Alex had been through a difficult experience in a remote part of Montana and needed time to heal. I was in my early 20s by then, old enough to know better than to pry, but curiosity gnawed at me. It wasn't until one late night, long after our parents had gone to bed, that Alex finally opened up. We were sitting on the back porch, and Alex had snuck a couple of beers from the fridge. One of Dad's rules was that Alex had to stay sober if they were going to live under our roof again, but after months of tension, Alex finally cracked. They handed me a beer and told me to keep quiet about it. As we drank, the walls began to come down, and I finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in my mind. What happened in Montana? Alex took a long swig of their beer, stared into the darkness, and began to tell the story. It all started during the winter break of Alex's final year. Tara had stumbled across an article about a self-sustaining community deep in the Montana wilderness. They called themselves the Silver Pines Collective, and their mission was to create a utopia free from the corruption and greed of modern society. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, and traded handmade goods in nearby towns for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. There was no money, no private property, just pure, communal living. Tara was instantly captivated. She convinced Alex that this was the future they'd been searching for. The collective was preparing for the new decade, and they were recruiting like-minded individuals to join their cause. Tara and Alex were told that if they didn't act soon, they might miss their chance to be part of something revolutionary. At first, Alex hesitated. They were so close to graduating, and dropping out felt like a huge risk. But Tara was relentless. She painted a picture of a life filled with purpose, freedom, and connection to nature. Eventually, Alex caved. They dropped out of school, packed their bags, and headed to Montana without telling anyone where they were going. When they arrived, they were met by a man named Jonah, one of the collective's recruiters. After a brief orientation, Jonah drove them deep into the wilderness to the collective's camp. It was a sprawling encampment hidden in the dense forest, with makeshift shelters, communal fire pits, and gardens carved into the earth. At first, it seemed idyllic. The people were warm and welcoming, and the sense of community was palpable. For the first few months, life in the collective was peaceful. Everyone worked together, shared everything, and lived by a strict code of mutual respect. There were no leaders, just a council of elders who made decisions for the group. Alex and Tara felt like they'd found their place in the world. But as the months passed, things began to change. The collective started attracting more people, some seeking refuge from the chaos of the outside world, others running from their pasts. Among them were individuals with dark histories, addicts, criminals, and people with violent tendencies. The elders tried to maintain order, but the influx of new members strained the collective's resources and tested its unity. Then came the first major incident. One night, a fire broke out in one of the communal tents. 2 people were badly burned and had to be taken to a nearby town for medical treatment. The elders insisted it was an accident, but whispers spread through the camp. Some believed it was arson, a deliberate act of sabotage by someone who'd been expelled from the collective weeks earlier. Tensions escalated. The elders decided to post armed guards around the perimeter of the camp to protect against intruders. But this decision came at a cost. The hunters who usually provided food for the group were now tasked with patrolling the camp, leaving fewer people to forage and hunt. Food became scarce, and people grew desperate. Theft and violence became commonplace. Fights broke out over scraps of food, and one woman was stabbed with a kitchen knife during an argument. The sense of community that had once defined the collective was crumbling. Alex and Tara began to question whether they'd made the right choice. Then, one morning, a young woman named Elise went missing. She'd left all her belongings behind, and no one had seen her leave. The elders organized search parties, but days passed with no sign of her. Fear and paranoia gripped the camp. During one of the searches, a group of members stumbled upon a man named Garrett who'd been expelled from the collective months earlier. He was living in a makeshift shelter not far from the camp, and it was clear he'd been stealing food from the collective stores. But what sent shockwaves through the group was the discovery of Elise's scarf in his possession. Garrett denied any involvement in Elise's disappearance, but no one believed him. The search party tried to bring him back to the camp for questioning, but Garrett fought back, stabbing one of the men in the process. He was eventually subdued and dragged back to the camp, where the elders decided to interrogate him. What followed was a descent into darkness. The interrogation quickly turned into torture. Garrett's screams echoed through the forest as the elders and their enforcers tried to extract a confession. Alex and Tara were horrified, but they felt powerless to stop it. The collective they'd once admired had become a nightmare. Days later, the elders called a meeting in the center of the camp. Garrett, battered and bloodied, was tied to a tree. The head elder, a man named Silas, addressed the group. He claimed Garrett had confessed to killing Elise, but refused to reveal what he'd done with her body. Silas declared that Garrett would be executed as punishment and as a warning to anyone who threatened the collective. Alex couldn't believe what they were hearing. This wasn't the peaceful, enlightened community they'd joined. This was something monstrous. But before they could process what was happening, a firing squad was assembled. 3 members of the collective stepped forward, raised their rifles, and fired. Garrett's body slumped against the tree, lifeless. The camp erupted into chaos. Some people screamed, others wept. Many packed their belongings and fled into the night. Alex and Tara knew they had to leave, but the elders had begun labeling certain members as essential and forbidding them from departing. Alex and Tara managed to slip away under the guise of going into town for supplies, leaving everything behind. They made their way to a nearby highway and hitchhiked to a small town where they stayed with an old friend of Tara's. For weeks, they debated whether to return to the camp to retrieve their belongings. Tara was determined to go back, but Alex refused. They argued for days until Tara finally decided to go alone. She never returned. A few days later, Alex saw a news report about a massive forest fire in the area where the collective was located. Firefighters had discovered several charred bodies near what appeared to be an abandoned campsite. Alex was devastated. They didn't know if Tara had been caught in the fire or if she'd simply abandoned them. Either way, they were alone. With nowhere else to go, Alex returned home, broken and haunted by what they'd experienced. They never spoke of it again, but the scars were visible in their eyes and their demeanor. The Alex who came back was not the same person who had left for Montana all those months ago. One of the most unsettling cases I ever worked on as a detective involved a suspected serial predator. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't track this man down. It was baffling, especially since we had crystal clear security footage of him. He matched the description given by the victims perfectly, and we immediately sent a forensics team to the scene to gather evidence. We managed to lift a fingerprint we believed was his, but when we ran it through state and federal databases, it came back with no matches. One of the victims mentioned noticing grease under her attacker's fingernails, so we showed his photo to every auto shop and mechanic in the surrounding 3 counties. Still, nothing. The guy paid in cash for everything, and as far as we could tell, he didn't own a car or even have a driver's license. He was living completely off the grid, which made him nearly impossible to trace. It was like chasing a ghost. Modern policing relies heavily on digital investigative techniques, tracking credit card transactions, scanning license plates on highways, or using cell tower pings to map a suspect's movements. Gone are the days when we could rely solely on witness statements and fingerprints. DNA is a game changer, of course, but being able to place someone at a specific location at a specific time is what really seals the deal in court. It's the kind of evidence that lands those 1-2 punches in the judicial system, ensuring the bad guys stay behind bars for a long time. But with this guy, we had nothing. Just a blurry image of a man with sunglasses and a scruffy beard, a face no one seemed to recognize. A few weeks into the investigation, another victim came forward with a story eerily similar to the first. The physical description she gave was completely different, but we knew it was the same guy. He used the same phrases, followed the same patterns before and after the attack, and even had the same distinct accent. Yet, without any way to track him, he was free to continue his reign of terror. If he kept up this pace, we were looking at dozens more victims in the coming months. It was a nightmare scenario for any law enforcement officer, a predator who was not only intelligent, but also highly motivated, and I had no idea how to stop him. Then, by sheer luck, we caught a break. The local police department received a call about an abandoned house in the outskirts of a rundown neighborhood called Ash Grove. It was a massive, decaying Victorian-style home that had been empty for years. A neighbor reported seeing someone coming and going from the property at odd hours, always acting suspiciously. The caller had seen our public appeals for information and decided to report it, thinking it was better to be safe than sorry. As it turned out, the house had been the subject of another report a few weeks earlier, but that call had been dismissed. The person who made the initial report sounded mentally unstable, claiming the house was haunted by something hungry. The dispatcher logged the call but didn't send anyone to investigate because the caller sounded frankly delusional. When we later tracked down the elderly woman we believed had made the call, she denied any memory of it. To this day, we're not sure how it ties into the case, but it's hard to ignore the coincidence. After the second call, 2 uniformed officers were sent to investigate the property. They searched the ground floor and the first floor, finding nothing but dust and decay. As they were about to leave, one of the officers noticed an old wardrobe pushed against a wall. When they moved it, they discovered a hidden door leading to the basement. They pried it open and descended into the darkness, flashlight beams cutting through the thick air. What they found down there was chilling. The basement was divided into 2 rooms. The first was cluttered with old furniture, broken appliances, and piles of junk. The second room, however, was something else entirely. It was a makeshift dark room, the kind photographers used decades ago. Battery-powered lanterns with red filters hung from clotheslines, casting an eerie glow over the space. Strung up on those lines were photographs of at least 15 different women. 2 of them were later identified as our victims, but at the time, the officers had no idea what they were looking at. While it's not illegal to have a dark room, The sheer number of photos and the way they were displayed sent a shiver down their spines. Before leaving, the officers decided to search the other basement room, the one filled with junk. That's when they found an old, industrial-sized refrigerator. It was the kind you'd see in a restaurant kitchen, tall and deep, with heavy doors. At first glance, it seemed like just another piece of discarded furniture, but something about it caught one officer's attention. He noticed small holes drilled into the doors, as if someone had modified it for ventilation. His instincts told him to open it, and what he found inside was horrifying. Inside the fridge was a 12-year-old girl. Her hands and feet were bound with duct tape, and a rag had been stuffed into her mouth to silence her. She was dehydrated and malnourished, her skin pale and clammy. The officers immediately called for backup and medical assistance. The girl was rushed to the hospital, where she slowly began to recover. When questioned, she had no memory of how long she'd been held captive, but she was able to lead us to the location where she'd been abducted and to her parents' home. Shockingly, her parents hadn't even realized she was missing. They thought she was staying with a friend. Child Protective Services got involved, and that opened up a whole other can of worms. Once we confirmed the house was connected to our suspect, we set up a surveillance team, including undercover officers working in shifts. We were certain he'd return to the property eventually, but he never did. We staked out the house for over a week, but no one matching his description came near the place. Eventually, we had to pull the team off to focus on other cases. That's when the case took a truly sinister turn. I was convinced we had him, but either we were incredibly unlucky, or he had some kind of sixth sense. I began to suspect that he might have been tipped off, either by someone working with him, or even more disturbingly, by someone within our own department. Over the next year, a few officers retired or transferred out, but none of them fit the profile of our suspect. There was also no single officer whose off-duty time aligned with both attacks, which made me wonder if we were dealing with more than one perpetrator. But without concrete evidence, accusing a fellow officer was out of the question. Years have passed, and the man who attacked those women and kidnapped that girl has never been caught. I'm convinced he's a highly sophisticated predator who had committed similar crimes long before we became aware of him. I have no doubt that, unless something drastic happens, he's still out there, preying on innocent women and subjecting them to horrors they may never fully recover from. If he's as compulsive as I believe he is, this is someone who has sacrificed everything, his identity, his place in society, just to continue indulging his darkest desires. It's a chilling thought, and one that haunts me to this day. My name is Gregory Hargrove, and I'm reaching out to you because of a story I've carried with me for over 3 decades, a story that's haunted me every single day since 1987. A friend of mine mentioned your channel, saying you delve into unsolved mysteries and unexplained phenomena. She told me your audience becomes deeply invested in the stories you tell. If that's true, then I need your help. My story is one that most people have forgotten, but I believe it deserves to be heard. Maybe, just maybe, you and your viewers can help me uncover the truth behind a mystery that's consumed my life. It all began in the summer of 1987. My younger brother, Thomas, had always been the kind of person who wore his heart on his sleeve. He was sensitive, creative, and full of dreams. But that year, something broke inside him. His wife, Evelyn, won a substantial amount of money from a lottery ticket, a stroke of luck that should have been a blessing. Instead, it became a curse. Before she even cashed the ticket, Evelyn had divorce papers drawn up. She was cunning, and she knew how to play the system. At the time, state laws favored her because she was unemployed, granting her more than half of their shared assets. To make matters worse, her high-powered lawyer from Los Angeles presented exaggerated claims about Thomas's drinking habits to the court. It wasn't long before she took their 2 children and left. Thomas was devastated. He hired his own lawyers, spending nearly every penny he had left trying to fight the court's decision. But it was no use. The case dragged on, and in the end, he lost everything: his home, his savings, and his children. He moved into my spare bedroom, a shell of the man he once was. For months, he barely left the room. He stopped shaving, stopped eating properly, and spent most of his days staring at the wall. My wife, Margaret, and I did our best to help him, but it felt like we were watching him slowly fade away. One day, out of the blue, Thomas seemed to snap out of it. He started showering regularly, eating meals with us, and even going for walks. At first, I was relieved. I thought he was finally turning a corner. But as the days went by, I noticed a strange intensity in his eyes. He became obsessed with something he wouldn't fully explain. When I asked him what had changed, he looked at me with a wild grin and said, "By this time next year, we're going to be richer than you can imagine." I didn't know what to make of it. Thomas had always been a dreamer, but this felt different. He started spending hours at the local library, poring over old maps, geology textbooks, and obscure scientific journals. He'd come home with stacks of books, his hands trembling with excitement. One evening, he dragged me into the guest room, where he had spread out a collection of maps and diagrams. He started rambling about energy lines, ancient fault systems, and something he called resonance frequencies. His words were disjointed, almost manic, and I couldn't follow half of what he was saying. But one thing was clear. He believed there was something hidden in the mountains of northern New Mexico, near the Sangre de Cristo range. Something valuable. Something life-changing. I was torn. On one hand, Thomas's obsession seemed delusional, the kind of thing you'd expect from someone who'd lost touch with reality. But on the other hand, it was the first time in months that he'd shown any spark of life. He was eating, sleeping, and taking care of himself. I didn't want to disrupt whatever fragile balance he'd found, so I decided to let it play out. I figured it was harmless, a strange hobby to keep him occupied. Then, one morning in late June, everything changed. I sent my youngest daughter, Emily, to wake Thomas for breakfast. She came back a few minutes later, looking confused. "Uncle Thomas isn't there," she said. I rushed to the spare room and found it empty. The bed was neatly made, and on the dresser was a note written in Thomas's messy handwriting. "Gone to New Mexico. I'll call when we're rich." That was the last time any of us saw or heard from him. I reported him missing immediately, but the police didn't take it seriously. They said he was an adult and had the right to disappear if he wanted to. I tried to explain that this wasn't like him, that he wasn't in his right mind, but they brushed me off. Over the next few months, I contacted every law enforcement agency I could think of, from local sheriffs to state police. I even hired a private investigator, but nothing came of it. By the end of 1987, the search had all but stopped. Everyone seemed to think Thomas was gone for good, either dead or living under a new identity. But I couldn't accept that. I knew my brother, and I knew he wouldn't just vanish without a trace. Then, in early 1988, I got a call from a man named Roland Graves. Roland was a seasoned tracker and survivalist who specialized in finding missing persons in remote areas. He'd worked with search and rescue teams across the country and had a reputation for getting results. When I explained Thomas's situation, he agreed to help, on one condition. He'd spend a week searching the Sangre de Cristo Mountains at his own expense. If he found nothing, he'd walk away. If he found something, we'd discuss payment. I agreed, grateful for any help I could get. Roland arrived in New Mexico in mid-February. He started by canvassing the small towns near the mountains, showing Thomas's photo to locals. At first, there were no leads. But then, in a tiny hardware store in the town of Red Mesa, a cashier recognized Thomas. She said he'd come in a few months earlier and bought a strange assortment of items: lumber, metal brackets, batteries, flashlights, and a heavy-duty respirator. Roland asked the store manager what someone might need those supplies for, and the man shrugged. "Either building a bunker or digging a tunnel," he said. That was the breakthrough we needed. Roland focused his search on the mountains, and after a few days, he found something: a hidden campsite tucked deep in the woods. It was well concealed, with a makeshift tent and a fire pit that hadn't been used in weeks. Inside the tent, Roland found more evidence of Thomas's presence. Stacks of books on geology and ancient civilizations, a journal filled with cryptic notes, and a collection of worn-out tools, picks, shovels, and a sledgehammer. There was also a large sum of cash, military-grade rations, and a water filtration system. It was clear that Thomas had been living off the grid for months, but there was no sign of him. The most disturbing discovery, however, was the tunnel. Roland followed a trail of disturbed earth to a narrow opening in the side of a hill. The entrance was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and the tunnel itself was crude and unstable. Roland ventured inside, but turned back after only a few dozen feet. The air was thin, and the walls were poorly reinforced. He warned me that going any deeper would be incredibly dangerous. But I couldn't just leave it at that. I had to know what Thomas had been searching for. Against Roland's advice, I traveled to New Mexico and made my way to the campsite. The tunnel was even more unsettling in person. It was dark, claustrophobic, and reeked of damp earth. I tied a rope around my waist and crawled inside, my flashlight cutting through the oppressive blackness. The further I went, the more the air seemed to thicken, until I could barely breathe. My eyes stung, and my head felt heavy, like I was being suffocated by the mountain itself. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a massive cavern. The space was so vast that my flashlight couldn't reach the walls or ceiling. The ground beneath me dropped away into a sheer cliff, and when I tossed a rock over the edge, I never heard it hit the bottom. It was as if the cavern went on forever, a bottomless pit into the earth. And there, hammered into the rock at the edge of the cliff, was a metal spike with a rope tied to it. The rope disappeared into the darkness below, and I knew, without a doubt, that Thomas had gone down there. I wanted to follow him, but Roland stopped me. He said the cavern was too dangerous, that the air was toxic and the rock unstable. He urged me to contact professional search and rescue teams, but when I did, they refused to help. They said the risk was too great, especially after so much time had passed. They believed Thomas was dead, and they weren't willing to risk lives to recover his body. But I don't believe he's dead. Not really. There's a part of me that feels like he's still down there, trapped in that endless darkness. And there's something else, something I can't quite explain. Whenever I think about that cavern, I feel a strange pull, like it's calling to me. It's as if the mountain itself is alive, and it's not done with Thomas yet. I'm not asking you or your viewers to go down there. I know how dangerous it is. But if there's any way you can help me uncover the truth about what Thomas was searching for, about what's hidden in that cavern, I'd be forever grateful. This mystery has haunted me for over 30 years, and I can't rest until I know what happened to my brother. One of the most unsettling experiences of my life happened when I was just 16 years old. It all began with an unexpected inheritance from a distant relative I barely knew. His name was Uncle Silas, a reclusive man who lived deep in the wilderness of northern Montana. My family rarely spoke of him, and when they did, it was always in hushed tones, as if his name carried some unspoken weight of dread. Uncle Silas was my grandmother's brother, but he had cut ties with most of the family decades ago. My mother referred to him as eccentric, though the way she said it made it clear she meant something far darker. She claimed he lived off the map, in a cabin surrounded by nothing but dense pine forests and silence. I didn't understand what that meant at the time. I imagined it as some kind of survivalist lifestyle, but as I grew older, I realized it was more than that. Uncle Silas wasn't just a hermit. He was a man who had chosen to live in isolation for reasons no one dared to question. When he passed away, I was surprised to learn that he had left something for me. A package arrived one afternoon, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. It was postmarked from a small town called Frostpine, a place I'd never heard of. Inside was a weathered wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with intricate carvings etched into its surface, strange symbols that looked like a mix of runes and jagged, unreadable script. The box smelled faintly of cedar and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic and sharp. Accompanying the box was a short, handwritten note from Uncle Silas's lawyer. It explained that Silas had specifically requested I receive this box and that it contained something of great importance. The note ended with a cryptic warning: handle its contents with care. Not everything is as it seems. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the box. Inside was a chaotic assortment of objects: old coins with unfamiliar markings, a rusted pocket knife, a small glass vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid, and a collection of odd trinkets that looked like they belonged in a museum of curiosities. Among the clutter was a tiny porcelain doll with its face cracked down the middle, its painted eyes staring blankly up at me. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I couldn't look away. As I sifted through the items, I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked into the bottom of the box. It was yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. Carefully, I unfolded it, revealing a strange, origami-like envelope. When I opened it, a lock of hair fell out, long, coarse, and jet black, like the mane of a wild animal. My stomach turned as I noticed the faint scent of decay clinging to it. Written inside the paper were a few lines in Uncle Silas's spidery handwriting. The words sent a chill down my spine. "Nephew, this hair belongs to a man I once knew. He was not a good man, and I did what had to be done. Keep this with you always. If you die with it in your possession, he will serve you in the next life. But be warned, he is not to be trusted. I'll see you when the time comes." The final line, "I'll see you when the time comes," stuck in my mind like a splinter. Was it a threat? A promise? I didn't know what to make of it, but the thought of Uncle Silas watching me from beyond the grave filled me with a deep, unshakable dread. I showed the box and its contents to my parents, hoping they could make sense of it. My mother's reaction was immediate and visceral. She recoiled from the lock of hair as if it were a venomous snake, her face pale and drawn. "Get rid of it," she said, her voice trembling. "Burn it. Bury it. I don't care what you do, but don't keep it in this house." My father, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as the ramblings of a disturbed old man. But even he seemed uneasy, his usual confidence wavering as he examined the strange carvings on the box. "Silas was always different," he said finally. "Best not to dwell on it." I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to throw the box away, to rid myself of its unsettling presence. But another part, a darker, more curious part, couldn't bring myself to let it go. What if Uncle Silas was telling the truth? What if the hair really did hold some kind of power? The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating. For weeks, I kept the box hidden under my bed, its contents haunting my dreams. I began to notice strange things, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, faint whispers in the dead of night, the feeling of being watched even when I was alone. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. One night, I woke to the sound of something scratching at my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the sound grew louder, more insistent. When I finally mustered the courage to look, I saw nothing but the dark outline of the trees outside, their branches swaying in the wind. But as I turned away, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the glass, a figure standing behind me, its face obscured by shadow. I spun around, but the room was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, a cold weight pressing down on me. I knew then that Uncle Silas's gift or curse was far more than I had bargained for. To this day, I still have the box. I've never been able to bring myself to destroy it, no matter how much I want to. And sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I swear I can hear Uncle Silas's voice, faint and distant, whispering those same haunting words, "I'll see you when the time comes."